Russia unshaken, the truth beneath the surface. Let me take you back to February 24, 2022, not the day Russia invaded Ukraine, but something far more revealing that happened just weeks later. On March 18, Colonel Douglas, Russia's staggering military losses, its economic contraction, and its diplomatic isolation. The message is Russia is losing, Ukraine is winning, and the West just needs to hold the line a little longer. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, there are several. First, let's talk about those Russian casualties. The US government and its allies have been touting numbers like 315,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded, a figure so staggering it would represent one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern history. But here's the data doesn't support it. Not even close. Independent analysts, including those at the Royal United Services Institute, have repeatedly questioned these figures, pointing out that Russia's force generation capacity has remained remarkably resilient. In 2023 alone, Moscow mobilized an estimated 400,000 new troops, more than enough to replace its losses and then some. And let's not forget that Russia's population is nearly 3 times that of Ukraine's. Even if the casualty rates were accurate, Russia can afford to lose men in a way Ukraine simply cannot. Then there's the economy. The West has imposed the most sweeping sanctions regime in history, cutting Russia off from SWIFT, freezing its foreign reserves, and banning its oil exports. And yet, Russia's economy didn't just avoid collapse, it grew. In 2023, its GDP exited by 3.6%, outpacing most Western economies. How? Because sanctions, as I've warned for decades, are a double-edged sword. Russia pivoted to Asia, selling its oil to China and India at discounted rates, while its defense industry shifted into overdrive, producing artillery shells at a rate the West can't match. Meanwhile, Europe's energy crisis sent inflation soaring, and American consumers paid the price at the pump. The sanctions hurt, but they didn't cripple. And they certainly didn't force Putin to the negotiating table. But here's where it gets really interesting. The official narrative assumes that Russia is fighting a war of choice, one it can afford to lose. But what if it's not? What if, from Moscow's perspective, this war is existential? Let me tell you something that rarely makes it into Western Russia's strategic doctrine has long identified NATO action as an existential threat. Not a hypothetical one, not a distant concern, but a red line. And for good reason. In 2008, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. In 2014, the US backed a coup in Kiev that installed a pro-Western government, one that immediately began cracking down on Russian-speaking regions. And in the years that followed, NATO conducted military exercises just miles from Russia's border, while the US poured billions in weapons into Ukraine. From Moscow's perspective, this wasn't containment. It was encirclement. Now, I'm not justifying Russia's invasion. War is always a tragedy, and the suffering of the Ukrainian people is real. But if we're going to understand this conflict, we have to see it through Russian eyes. And what they see is a West that has spent the last 3 decades extending its sphere of influence right up to their doorstep, while insisting that Russia has no right to a sphere of its own. That's not just hypocrisy. It's a recipe for war. And that brings us to the broader geopolitical context, a context that the mainstream media almost never explores. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of the unipolar moment, the collapse of American hegemony, and the rise of a multipolar world. For 30 years, the United States has acted as the world's sole superpower, imposing its will through military force, economic coercion, and ideological dominance. But that era is over. China's rise, Russia's resurgence, and the fragmentation of the global order have made it impossible for Washington to maintain its dominance. And yet, rather than adapt, the U.S. foreign policy establishment has doubled down, treating every challenge as an existential threat that must be crushed. This is where the Ukraine war becomes a proxy for something much larger. For the U.S., it's not just about defending Ukraine. It's about weakening Russia, containing China, and reasserting American primacy. For Russia, it's about survival, preventing NATO from turning Ukraine into a forward operating base for Western power. And for China, it's a test case. If Russia can be defeated, Beijing knows its end. That's why China has quietly supported Moscow, not out of ideological affinity, but out of cold, hard strategic calculation. The same goes for Iran, North Korea, and even India, which has refused to condemn Russia despite Western pressure. This is the new great game, and we're watching it play out in real time. The problem? The US is fighting it with the same playbook it's used for the last 30 years, one that assumes military superiority, economic dominance, and ideological appeal will always prevail. But the world has changed. The US no longer enjoys the unchallenged supremacy it did in the 1990s. China's economy is on track to surpass America's within a decade. Russia, despite its flaws, remains a nuclear superpower with a military that has adapted to modern warfare in ways the West didn't anticipate. And the global South, from India to Brazil to South Africa, is no longer willing to blindly follow Washington's lead. Let me be, this isn't about taking sides. It's about understanding reality. And the reality is that the US is fighting a war it cannot win, not in the way it's currently being fought. The idea that Ukraine can defeat Russia militarily, reclaim all its lost territory, and force Moscow to accept a humiliating peace is a fantasy. It's the same fantasy that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, wars that were supposed to be quick, decisive, and transformative, but instead became quagmires that drained blood and treasure for no discernible gain. And yet, the hawks in Washington keep pushing for more. More weapons. More money. More escalation. They talk about sending F-16s, ATACMS, and long-range missiles, as if these will somehow tip the balance. But here's the Russia has already adapted. Its air defenses have neutralized Ukraine's drone strikes. Its electronic warfare has jammed Western communications. And its artillery, once outgunned, now outranges and outproduces Ukraine's. The West is sending Ukraine just enough to keep it in the fight, but not enough to win. And that's by design. Because the real goal isn't victory. It's bleeding Russia dry, even if it means bleeding Ukraine dry in the process. But here's where the domestic political dimension comes into play, a dimension that's just as important as the military one. The Biden administration isn't just fighting a war in Ukraine. It's fighting a war for its own survival. Let's not forget that Biden's approval ratings are in the toilet, inflation is still a problem, and the 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on his presidency. And what's the one issue where Biden can still claim bipartisan support? Ukraine. The war has become a political lifeline, a way to rally the country around a cause that's supposed to be above politics. But it's not. It's deeply political. The administration knows that if Ukraine collapses, Biden's foreign policy legacy collapses with it. That's why they've been so reluctant to push for negotiations. That's why they've dismissed every Russian peace overture as a ploy. And that's why they've framed the war as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, a framing that leaves no room for compromise. Because in Washington's eyes, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about America's role in the world. And if the US backs down, it sends a message to China, to Iran, to every American power is waning. But here's the American people are starting to see through the narrative. Polls show that support for Ukraine aid is declining, especially among Republicans. And as the war drags on, the cracks in the bipartisan consensus are starting to show. That's why the administration is so desperate to keep the war going, because if it ends, the political reckoning will be swift. And that's a reckoning the establishment isn't ready for. So where does this leave us? Let's consider the scenarios. The best-case scenario, from Washington's perspective, is that Ukraine holds the line, Russia exhausts itself, and the war ends in a negotiated settlement that leaves Ukraine intact but neutral. The probability of this? Low. Russia isn't going to accept a deal that leaves it worse off than before the war. And Ukraine, despite its bravery, can't sustain the fight indefinitely. The most likely scenario is a frozen conflict, a stalemate that drags on for years, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Ukraine becomes a permanent ward of the West, dependent on endless aid, while Russia consolidates its gains in the East. The probability of this? High. It's the path of least resistance, and it's the one both sides are already preparing for. The worst-case scenario? Escalation. A desperate Ukraine launches a major offensive with Western weapons, Russia responds with tactical nukes, and the war spirals out of control. The probability of this? Higher than you think. Putin has already warned that Russia will use all means necessary to defend its territory. And if he feels cornered, he might just do it. But here's the: none of these scenarios are good. Not for Ukraine. Not for Russia. And certainly not for the United States. Because the real tragedy of this war isn't just the lives lost or the cities destroyed. It's the fact that it was entirely preventable. If the US had been willing to negotiate a neutral Ukraine, if NATO had respected Russia's red lines, if the West had accepted that the post-Cold War order was over, none of this would have happened. But instead, we got hubris. We got the belief that America could reshape the world in its image, no matter the cost. And that brings me to the grand strategy question, the one that no one in Washington wants to answer. What is America's endgame here? Is it to weaken Russia? To contain China? To reassert unipolar dominance? Because if that's the goal, it's not working. Russia is stronger today than it was before the war. China is more assertive. And the global South is more skeptical of American leadership than ever. The US is spending billions to fight a war it can't win, while its own infrastructure crumbles, its debt skyrockets, and its people grow increasingly disillusioned. This is the pattern of empire decline. The British Empire spent the 19th century fighting wars to maintain its dominance, only to collapse under the weight of its own overextension. The Soviet Union did the same in the 20th century, bankrupting itself in Afghanistan while its economy stagnated. And now, the US is repeating the same mistakes, fighting unwinnable wars, alienating allies, and ignoring the warning signs of decline. So what should we do instead? First, we need to accept that the unipolar moment is over. The world is multipolar now, and America's goal should be to manage that transition, not resist it. That means diplomacy, not escalation. It means recognizing that Russia has legitimate security concerns, just as the US does. And it means accepting that Ukraine, for all its heroism, cannot be the front line of a new Cold War. Second, we need to stop treating war as the first option. The US has spent the last 30 years bombing its way to solutions, only to find that bombs don't build nations. They destroy them. If we want to counter Russia and China, we should do it through economic competition, technological innovation, and diplomatic engagement, not through endless military interventions. Third, we need to stop outsourcing our foreign policy to the military-industrial complex. The defense industry profits from war. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's a fact. And as long as they're calling the shots, we'll keep getting more wars, more spending, and more instability. Finally, we need to have an honest conversation about what's at stake. The American people deserve to know the truth, that this war isn't about democracy, it's about power. That Ukraine can't win, no matter how many weapons we send. And that the only way out is through negotiation, not escalation. But here's the establishment doesn't want that conversation. Because if the public knew the truth, they'd demand change. And change is the last thing the foreign policy blob wants. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. One path leads to more war, more debt, and more decline. The other leads to realism, restraint, and a recognition that America's best days don't have to be behind it, but they won't come from fighting unwinnable wars. The choice is ours. But first, we have to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And that starts with listening to voices like Macgregor's, not because they're always right, but because they challenge the narrative that's leading us into the abyss. In the end, that's the real lesson of this war. Not that Russia is unshaken, but that America is. And if we don't wake up soon, we'll shake ourselves to pieces. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the entire architecture of global power that the US has spent the last 3 decades trying to maintain, and the cracks in that system are becoming impossible to ignore. The war in Ukraine isn't an isolated conflict, it's a stress test for the post-Cold War order, and the results aren't flattering for Washington. Russia, for all its flaws, has demonstrated something that should terrify the foreign policy: the ability to absorb punishment, adapt, and outlast a Western coalition that was supposed to be invincible. Let me explain why this matters. For years, we've been told that NATO's military superiority was so overwhelming that no rational adversary would dare challenge it. The Gulf War in 1991, Kosovo in 1999, even the initial phases of the Iraq War in 2003, these were supposed to be proof that American power, backed by precision weapons and unmatched logistics, could dictate outcomes on the battlefield. But Ukraine has exposed the limits of that thinking. Russia's military, once dismissed as a corrupt, second-rate force, has not only held its ground but has begun to systematically dismantle Ukraine's defenses in ways that should force a reckoning in Washington. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military, for all its trillion-dollar budgets, is not prepared for the kind of war Russia is waging. This isn't a conflict of high-tech drones and surgical strikes, it's a grinding, attritional war where mass matters more than precision. Russia has mobilized its economy, its industry, and its population in ways that the US hasn't had to contemplate since World War II. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is still structured around the assumption that it can fight two major regional conflicts simultaneously, an assumption that looks increasingly delusional when you consider that the US is struggling to sustain a single proxy war in Ukraine while simultaneously trying to deter China in the Pacific. And that brings me to the broader geopolitical implications. The war in Ukraine wasn't just about Ukraine. It was about sending a message to the rest of that the US and its allies could impose their will on any nation that stepped out of line. But the message that's actually being received is very different. Countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and even traditional US partners like Saudi Arabia and Turkey are watching this unfold, and they're drawing conclusions. They see a West that's economically overstretched, politically divided, and militarily bogged down in a conflict it can't win. And they're asking, if this is what happens when you defy Washington, is it really worth the risk? That's why we're seeing a wave of neutrality, hedging, and outright defiance from the global South. Take India, for example. Despite US pressure, New Delhi has not only refused to sanction Russia but has increased its purchases of Russian oil, weapons, and even technology. Why? Because India's leadership understands something that Washington seems to have in the 21st century. Power isn't just about military might, it's about economic resilience, strategic autonomy, and the ability to play multiple sides. The US can't afford to alienate India, just as it can't afford to alienate the rest of the world that's quietly moving away from the dollar-dominated financial system. Now, let's talk about China. The Biden administration's entire Indo-Pacific strategy is built on the idea that the US can contain China's rise by rallying allies and maintaining military dominance in the region. But Ukraine has exposed the fatal flaw in that the US can't fight two major wars at once. If China were to make a move on Taiwan tomorrow, the US would be forced to choose between abandoning Ukraine or leaving Taiwan to fend for itself. And Beijing knows it. That's why Chinese officials have been so vocal in their support for Russia, not out of ideological solidarity, but because they see this war as a way to tie down American resources and attention while they consolidate their position in Asia. Here's the: China isn't just watching this war, it's learning from it. Every mistake the West makes in Ukraine, every miscalculation, every overreach, every failed sanctions regime is a lesson for Beijing. They're studying how Russia has adapted to Western weapons, how it's circumvented sanctions, and how it's managed to keep its economy afloat despite being cut off from the global financial system. And they're applying those lessons to their own preparations for a potential conflict over Taiwan. If the US thinks it can fight China the same way it's fighting Russia, it's in for a rude awakening. But the most dangerous lesson of all is the one that Washington refuses to: that military power alone can't solve political problems. The US has spent the last 20 years trying to bomb, drone, and sanction its way to stability in the Middle East, only to leave behind failed states, humanitarian disasters, and a region more unstable than ever. Now, it's repeating the same mistakes in Europe. The idea that more weapons, more sanctions, and more escalation will somehow force Russia to capitulate is a fantasy. If anything, it's doing the opposite: it's hardening Russian resolve, rallying domestic support for Putin, and convincing the rest of the world that the US is more interested in prolonging the war than in ending it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with do we double down on a strategy that's clearly not working, or do we accept that the world has changed and that America's role in it must change too? The establishment will tell you that any retreat from Ukraine is a sign of weakness, that any negotiation with Russia is appeasement, that any reduction in military spending is surrender. But that's the same kind of thinking that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, wars that cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and left the world less safe than before. The alternative isn't isolationism. It's realism. It's recognizing that the US can't be the world's policeman, that it can't fight every battle, and that its power has limits. It's understanding that in a multipolar world, diplomacy, economic competition, and strategic restraint are more effective tools than endless war. And it's accepting that the only way to secure America's future is to focus on rebuilding at home, on infrastructure, on education, on innovation, rather than on fighting unwinnable wars abroad. The question is whether Washington is capable of that kind of self-reflection. The signs aren't encouraging. The same people who got us into this mess are still in charge, still pushing the same failed policies, still profiting from the same military-industrial complex. But the American people aren't stupid. They see the cost of these wars in their wallets, in their communities, in the headlines every day. And sooner or later, they're going to demand a different path. The tragedy is that it might take another disaster, a real one, not just a proxy war, to wake them up. But by then, it could be too late. The world is moving on, with or without us. The question is whether America will move with it, or whether it will be left behind, clinging to a vision of global dominance that no longer reflects reality. The choice is ours. But time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about foreign policy, it's about domestic survival. The same forces that have pushed America into these endless wars are the ones that have hollowed out its industrial base, gutted its middle class, and turned its politics into a circus of performative outrage. And if you think the two aren't connected, you haven't been paying attention. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. defense budget for 2024 is $886 billion, more than the next 10 countries combined, including China and Russia. That's not just a number, that's a statement of priorities. It's the equivalent of spending $2,400 per American citizen, per year, on a military that hasn't won a major war since 1945. Meanwhile, the American Society of Civil Engineers gives the country's infrastructure a C-, with a $2.6 trillion backlog in repairs. Bridges are crumbling, water systems are failing, and the power grid is one major storm away from catastrophic collapse. But sure, let's keep sending $60 billion to Ukraine while Flint, Michigan, still doesn't have clean water. Here's the uncomfortable: the military-industrial complex isn't just a lobby, it's a parasite. It doesn't just influence policy, it shapes the entire economy. Defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman don't just sell weapons, they sell jobs, congressional districts, and campaign donations. And they've done an extraordinary job of making sure that any talk of cutting military spending is met with howls of weakness and isolationism. Never mind that the US could cut its defense budget by 20% and still outspend China 3-1. Never mind that the F-35 program, costing $1.7 trillion over its lifetime, has been plagued by delays, cost overruns, and performance issues so severe that the Pentagon's own testing office called it not effective in combat. No, the real problem is that some congressman from Alabama might lose a few thousand jobs if we stop building tanks the army doesn't want. But the rot goes deeper than just money. The same people who tell you that Russia is an existential threat also tell you that the US can't afford universal healthcare, that student debt relief is socialism, and that climate change is a hoax. They'll spend trillions on wars but balk at a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. They'll lecture you about the dangers of Russian propaganda while their own media outlets push narratives so detached from reality that even their own intelligence agencies have to walk them back. Remember the Russian bounties story in 2020? The one that dominated headlines for weeks, with pundits demanding retaliation? Turns out it was based on uncorroborated intelligence, and the Pentagon later admitted there was no evidence to support it. But by then, the damage was done, the narrative had been set, the outrage had been stoked, and the military-industrial complex had another reason to keep the money flowing. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions of this. The war in Ukraine has become a litmus test for loyalty in Washington. Question the blank check policy, and you're a Putin apologist. Suggest that maybe, just maybe, diplomacy should play a role, and you're accused of appeasement. This isn't new. It's the same playbook they used during the Iraq War, when anyone who opposed the invasion was labeled a traitor. The difference now is that the stakes are higher, the margins thinner, and the consequences more immediate. Take the 2024 election. On one side, you have a president who has staked his legacy on Ukraine, framing the war as a battle between democracy and autocracy. Never mind that Ukraine's democracy was ranked partly free by Freedom House even before the war, or that its government has banned opposition parties, shut down media outlets, and arrested critics. Never mind that the US has a long history of propping up dictators when it suits its interests, from Pinochet to the Shah to Mubarak. No, in this narrative, Ukraine is the last line of defense against tyranny, and anyone who questions that is a Russian asset. On the other side, you have a former president who has made no secret of his admiration for Putin, who has called NATO obsolete, and who has suggested that the US should let Russia do whatever the hell they want to NATO members who don't spend enough on defense. Now, I'm no fan of Trump. His foreign policy was a mess of contradictions, and his transactional approach to alliances did real damage. But at least he recognized that America's endless wars were unsustainable. The problem is that his solution wasn't strategic restraint, it was chaos. He didn't want to end the wars, he just wanted to win them quickly, by whatever means necessary. And that's not a strategy, that's a recipe for disaster. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a political class that is either too ideologically rigid or too transactional to chart a new course. It leaves us with a media ecosystem that profits from conflict and has no incentive to ask hard questions. And it leaves us with a public that is exhausted, divided, and increasingly skeptical of the entire enterprise. But here's the American people aren't as stupid as the elites think. They see the cost of these wars in their paychecks, in their communities, in the headlines every day. They see that the same people who told them Iraq had WMDs are now telling them that Ukraine is the last stand for democracy. They see that the same people who said Afghanistan would be a quick victory are now saying that Russia is on the verge of collapse. And they're starting to. When does it end? The answer, unfortunately, is that it doesn't, not until something breaks. And that something could be the US economy, which is already showing signs of strain. Inflation is still running hot, interest rates are at a 22-year high, and the national debt is approaching $35 trillion. The US is spending more on interest payments than on defense, and that gap is only going to widen. At some point, the bill comes due. And when it does, the establishment will have to admit they were wrong, or double down. I don't like their odds. History suggests they'll double down. Look at Vietnam. The US lost that war in 1973, but it took another 2 years for the last helicopters to evacuate Saigon. Look at Afghanistan. The US knew it was losing for years, but it took a chaotic withdrawal to finally admit defeat. The pattern is always the escalate, escalate, escalate until the cost becomes unbearable. And by then, it's too late. So what's the alternative? It's not isolationism. It's not surrender. It's recognizing that the world has changed, and that America's role in it must change too. It's understanding that the US can't be the world's policeman, that it can't fight every battle, and that its power has limits. It's accepting that in a multipolar world, diplomacy, economic competition, and strategic restraint are more effective tools than endless war. And it's focusing on rebuilding at home, on infrastructure, on education, on innovation, so that America can compete in the 21st century, not just fight the wars of the 20th. The question is whether Washington is capable of that kind of self-reflection. The signs aren't encouraging. The same people who got us into this mess are still in charge, still pushing the same failed policies, still profiting from the same military-industrial complex. But the American people aren't stupid. They see the cost of these wars in their wallets, in their communities, in the headlines every day. And sooner or later, they're going to demand a different path. The tragedy is that it might take another disaster, a real one, not just a proxy war, to wake them up. But by then, it could be too late. The world is moving on, with or without us. The question is whether America will move with it, or whether it will be left behind, clinging to a vision of global dominance that no longer reflects reality. The choice is ours. But time is running out. And the clock is ticking.